Hello, good evening everyone. Welcome to Tate Britain. My name's Richard Martin. I'm Curator of Public Programmes here at Tate. And it's an immense pleasure to welcome you all to this very special conversation between Lubaina Himid and Maria Balshaw. When Lubaina Himid was announced as the winner of the 2017 Turner Prize in Hull last December, the huge joy that greeted the news reflected just how much her work has meant to so many people over the last 4 decades. The first black woman to win the prize, Lubaina has explored, satirized, and challenged notions of institutional and historical visibility through paintings, drawings, installations, woodcuts, works made on porcelain, and works made on the inside of furniture drawers. Her practice also extends with famed generosity to encompass curating, writing, teaching, and mentoring, and she's currently Professor of Contemporary Art at the University of Central Lancashire. We're thrilled that Lubaina can be with us this evening to celebrate her Turner Prize success, but also to reflect on an extraordinary career and her latest body of work that confirms an ongoing commitment to new forms of storytelling. To discuss Lubaina's work with her this evening, I'm delighted that we're joined by the Director of Tate, Maria Balshaw. There will also be an opportunity for you to join the conversation, so I encourage you to formulate questions for Lubaina and Maria and to wait for the microphone when the moment arrives. And with a sold-out auditorium, I'm especially glad that thanks to my colleagues filming the event, we'll be able to share this discussion with digital audiences all over the world. Tonight also marks the opening of our public programme for this year's Turner Prize. The exhibition featuring the 4 shortlisted artists curated by Lindsay Young and Elsa Cousteau opened here at the end of September. And over the next 3 months, there's a whole range of ways that you can engage with the issues raised by the prize, thinking through questions of power, visibility, and truth. We're running workshops, for example, with contemporary artists, educators, activists, and therapists, exploring just what constitutes achievement in the arts today and the skills, the support, and the resilience that are needed to thrive. We're also hosting a special panel discussion in this auditorium with curators, programmers, and theorists looking at the different forms of moving image work that are represented on the shortlist and how they might speak to wider practices, politics, and ethics. I know that many of you have bought an additional ticket to enjoy a private view of the Turner Prize exhibition this evening. Once we finish here in the auditorium at 8 p.m, if you head to the foyer outside, my colleagues will be able to guide you through the galleries. Thank you all for coming. It promises to be a brilliant evening. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Lubaina Himid and Maria Balshaw.
Thank you for coming, Lubaina, and being here with me this evening. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Richard's beautifully covered some of your many roles and titles. The only things I wanted to add were, I think, mentor for many people, supervisor, as well as teacher and professor, and, as we might touch on, I thought, in the conversation, a fellow Northerner.
Indeed.
Absolutely. So most conversations that Lubaina and I have had have been up north rather than down south, yes. And we might reflect on the difference about that. But I thought we should start the conversation with the piece that's here at Tate Britain, which is in Tate's collection and is currently on display in the last section of the collections displays here, the 60 years. And as I was preparing, I was rather marvelling. Of course, you have been making work and curating work for 40 of the 60 years.
Well, thank you.
Which, of course...
Thank you for that.
And I've been looking at it for that length of time, so it all goes past rather faster than we ever realise. But and I want us to spend quite a bit of time in the conversation talking about now and recent stuff. Yeah. But this gave a nice sort of jumping off point for thinking about the past as well as the present. And I was reading that you said about this piece that it is in part a commentary on the silly games that cultural institutions play, that have been played through history, particularly for artists of colour and women of colour. So I wondered if you wanted to just start by reflecting maybe on 30 or 40 years and some of the games that you've seen and resisted.
Oh, well, I'm not sure now that I've resisted them. I've probably given in to them all now. But yeah, I guess I was very aware in the 1980s that we were perhaps given space so that funding could be acquired. It was always my strategy to run with that because I guess I am a woman of principle, but I'd rather not have the principles and allow other people to have principles, if you know what I mean. So if there's something on offer that's I see the game, I think, okay, well, I'll go with it and see what can be achieved by doing that. And I think, I've been aware for a long time that we've been part of collections or part of exhibitions when it was politically astute to be, for us to be so, and when it wasn't politically astute, then we weren't. But I think sometimes what I've tried to do is sort of force the issue a little bit and say yes to things so that then I can ask for more. I could do the songs from Oliver now, but I won't. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the most important thing, is that I kind of see if I'm looking back over 40 years, which is quite difficult, because I'm only 45, so it's kind of,
Obviously.
it's hard to do that, to look over that amount of time and understand whether it's been a waste of time, which sometimes it feels like, or whether actually something useful got done. But I think overall, I always saw my role as somebody who would risk saying yes to something that perhaps it wasn't entirely done with the most genuine kind of principles, and that I would just put my foot in the door and see who else I could get through the door at the same time. That kind of old salesman on the doorstep thing, I think.
Very pragmatist artist.
Yeah.
But taking it somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it has always been about the pieces of work that I make, but also it's about what can the pieces of work that I make do. They're made, and then that's just the beginning of them. I have a certain kind of relationship with them when I'm making them that is between the pieces of work and me, but then the point after that is, now what can they do? Who are they talking to? What can they say? What can they change, really?
And I've always been struck by the way in which as works arrive in a collection, they start to do something as they join the rest of the works that are there. And one of our former colleagues in Manchester used to describe it as introducing undetonated grenades into the body of works. And so this work in particular, I think the carrot piece comes into Tate Britain's collection, and it sits within this institution and the national and international collections. And it's the work it gets to do some work then.
Yeah, that's the point. But I think, I would never describe my work in that kind of violent way. It's much more like perfume. It's much more like, a woman comes into the room and she has a particular perfume on, and that changes the atmosphere of the room. and then she leaves and the perfume is left behind. It's much more. I'm much more trying to do that, so that the work is kind of entering your body, not blowing it apart. None of it is work about destroying anything. It's all about shifting the chemistry of it, shifting the kind of position of it, or the colour of it even, but not a detonator, a hand grenade. People have said to me in the past, you're a cultural terrorist. It was a long time ago, but that was hurtful because it wasn't about that kind of act. It was never about an act of terror. It's always been an act of negotiation and reasoning and cups of coffee and exchanging stuff,
And I was reading a phrase of yours where you talked about brokering a deal.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's the brokering that I think is very interesting.
Yeah, and I think when audiences come to see works, they also are bringing, I've said this a lot, but, they're bringing so much into a room, so many lives, their own lives, their families' lives, their friends' lives. They're bringing all that into the room. And it sounds a bit, cosmic or whatever, but that must make a difference. The heat of that and the strength of that and the kind of blood of that comes into a room and interacts with the artwork, where I've put all that stuff into that artwork. And I kind of really, although it seems odd, but I really sort of, that's what I'm trying to do. It's about what you... And it isn't really about audiences coming in, looking at the work and thinking they can change the world, but they might change something about just how they spend the rest of the day. They might ring somebody that they wouldn't have thought of ringing, or just read something they wouldn't have thought of reading. It's those tiny little changes that I'm interested in. And that's what I'm trying to do with the work. And see, sort of encourage those tiny things, just doing the thing that you can do only.
Yeah. So, A Fashionable Marriage. Made in 1986, and again, I'm interested in the past and the now. It was seen again and seen for the first time for very, very many people as part of the places here at Nottingham Contemporary. And last year was an extraordinary year for you.
It was, yes.
2 shows that result in a Turner Prize nomination, and this show is quite... And we'll come back to the Turner Prize later. But as I was looking at the places here, and I thought... the inclusion of your work in that show was very important, and it was an incredibly important show. But it did, to me, refer back to Thin Black Line. And so I was thinking of it as a kind of sequel, because you often work in series. Yeah. It's almost like a sequel that came 32 years later. And I wondered if you could just reflect a bit on both the importance of the show, The Thin Black Line, and then this, 3 decades later, and how did the work feel different?
Well, in The Thin Black Line, I showed the carrot piece, and the point it was quite particularly a show about what young black women were making. What we were making, the conversations we were having, the music we listened to, the lives we led. And it was a conversation in the ICA in what was then quite a narrow corridor. And the point of the exhibition, and there were 11 of us in that show. I particularly selected 11 of us because that was kind of a peculiar number. So it was clear that by selecting 11, there must be what I used to call eleventy. So if there'd been 6, maybe there were only 6. But if there were 11, then we've got to be more. So and I really crowded out the corridor so that it was too much work for the corridor. But you had to go down this corridor to get to the bar, to get to the theatre. And it was specifically called the Thin Black Line. For that reason, it referred exactly to the geographical sort of thing of it. But it was about the conversations that we had as women with each other. The difference between that and the places here is that it included pretty much everything that was going on. So that all the groups that some of the women in the Thin Black Line also belonged to, from the Black Art group, Marlene Smith and Claudette Johnson were in that show. And so the show at Nottingham Contemporary was a kind of blockbuster version. Mm-hmm. I was trying to say something quite simple, which was that we were not the leaders of this black art movement. We were central to every single set of creative things that were going on. There were writers in that show, like Maud Salter. Ingrid Pollard was very connected to theatre groups as well as music and as well as poets, So, and I guess the point was, I suppose I best try to then make the point halfway between the Thin Black Line in 1985, and the Nottingham Contemporary Show in Thin Black Lines at Tate Britain in 2011, where I was very much then not recreating those shows, but bringing that work to Tate and trying to talk about how some of the work that we did threaded through many of the lines of black creativity happening in Britain, that we were, that those lines of creativity were interwoven with each other. And I think that's one of the most important things to me, is that I think that the women that I worked with and the women that I'm working with now, who are some of the same women, have kept some of those threads alive in really difficult years, kept lots of those conversations alive, and those interconnections between different areas of creativity. Because I think there is slightly less ego and more overview in the way that we kind of work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the things that the places here did really have in common with your principles there is the 11ty principle, because it was a blockbuster of a show. It was hugely admired and successful in every way, but it also suggested this is just the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, it was a risky show.
Yeah.
It was risky because, and I think to some degree, because we had trusted how Nick Aitken curated, I can't remember the name of the show we had at the Van Abbe Museum in 2015. I think because we trusted his curatorial vision, that he wouldn't leave us in the lurch in the 80s, because that's why we would avoid that kind of exhibition. Yeah. All of us, all across the board, is because it's too easy to box us, package us in some other place. Yeah. And I think the thing is that the influence that we had, even though in the interim years it didn't really feel that was happening, is kind of important to what's happening today. And so it was a risky thing to be in a show that was ostensibly about the 1980s. But I think what a lot of the work did was that if you had known it was made in the 1980s, you wouldn't necessarily know. There's a kind of real energy and connection and strength to so much of it that was kind of a relief. You thought, no, it doesn't look like some... In a bad way. It doesn't look like a museum show in a bad way. Yeah.
And I think particularly for you, because it felt like it landed in the world at roughly the same moment as the two shows, Spike Island and Museum, the Modern Art Oxford, kind of also arrived in people's awareness. Yeah. And they are now. And so there was a connection made across the three, which was really about talking about now.
Just. It's a scary thing to see work in three galleries that you made maybe 20, 30 and 40 years ago. Yeah. So it was frightening, really. I mean, it was frightening in some ways because, of course, I always want to fiddle with it if I see it. That's definitely the dangerous thing. But, yeah, so it was good, and I suppose but yeah, it was risky. I could have just laid down in a corner weeping, you know. Because it's hard to see your life stretched out behind you, you know.
But I think I was looking at some of the reviews and responses, both from kind of visitors, but also the critics, and it was being read through an incredibly contemporary lens, which in part I think is because so many younger generation visitors were coming and they were seeing it for the first, so they were seeing it now.
I didn't read any of those things. I have a thing where I go like this. So I didn't actually read them. I tried not to. But I definitely got that feeling that younger people were coming and making connections, with all kinds of other things. They were making connections, with my work, but also some of those other people that I was working with, and perhaps coming to galleries that they hadn't necessarily been to before. Yeah, which was good. Yeah, and talks and those sort of associated programs that are kind of pretty essential, I think. Yeah, you know.
And as a museum professional, I was both delighted and shocked that Oxford and Bristol had managed to do these shows at the same time with one artist, and even more surprised when one of the reviews that you might have opened and closed straight away again was by a well-known London art critic who had managed to go to both of those regional venues and wrote about them in one review. And so it felt also that there was something of a vindication of the career choices you have made, staying in Lancaster, or near Lancashire.
Preston.
Yeah.
We have the word Preston has to be said at least.
It does.
Once,
My apologies.
Yes.
But being there and having made shows down the years, I brought some visual aids, Rochdale, the wonderful Harris Gallery in Preston, and that you've consistently worked across the regions. And these two, your shows, and then the Turner Prize nomination itself confirmed that regional galleries are showing the important work that London has to go and see.
Yes, but those regional galleries at one point were the only places where some of us could show, because they were encouraged by London. I mean, I think that glory of the garden policy thing, I don't know how long ago that was, encouraged that collecting and showing of black work, essentially. So they were able to buy it for their collections. But, I mean, those three galleries were, in a sense, in a would you call it, a syndicate together. I mean, they were thinking, they came up with the ideas sort of separately, but then worked together to make that work. Yeah. And it is important to show outside London, but it's very important to show inside London. And I think that it's easy to say, that I'm championing not, showing in the regions, but it's the regions that wanted to show it. So, and that's where the support has been, and the support has been on and off across the board, I think, with many of us showing in Birmingham, in Bristol, yes, in Hull before now, even before the Turner Prize, and, those were and also some very small galleries like Rochdale, which are very big and beautiful, but small in terms of maybe its reputation. Yeah, Liverpool and Manchester. I think that was where the offers of shows were. Had the offers of shows been in London, somewhere, in between, the Thin Black Line and Thin Black Lines, I would be saying, yes, thank you very much.
Yeah. But collaboration, as you say, was part of those three institutions working together. I know the directors there to be particularly collaborative and generous beings. So say a little bit more, and you touched on it a moment ago, your co-collaborators, the artists that you've worked alongside. To me, there's something very important about the way that you have worked with and alongside and championed or co-curated or co-created with other people. And that seems to me an important part of your practice.
Well, I think some of them would say I bossed them about, but I would say that it was collaborating. And I think it's to do with totally understanding that each of us have totally different things to bring to the table. And none of us ever wanted to be the only black artist in the village. We're just simply not interested in that. It's meaningless. And so it's always made absolute sense. I'm quite good at the upfront talking our way in there. Other people are very good at the finishing the details of things, which I'm not very good at. Loads of people in the room will know. And others of us are good at understanding that there's a long game, and then others really understand the intense importance of talking about the work as opposed to the strategy. And I think what happens to me often is that I'm in conversation and people ask me about the strategy and the politics, and I can wax lyrical about that. But what we don't do enough, and what we are always trying to do, whether Marlene Smith wants to talk about it, or Ingrid Pollard, or Sonia Boyce, we want to talk about the actual pieces, Because if you have other artists here, you would be talking, here and in other places, we would be talking about why is there so much blue in this? Why is there collage in that? Why can you see the backs of things? And those are part of a bigger strategy for communicating with audiences and with each other. But that's the way that we do the strategy we do, is through the pieces of work. Yeah. We do spend a lot of time taking a lot of care about the objects themselves, but a lot of time talking about the bigger political thing of it.
Yeah, well, that's quite a nice cue, and we haven't rehearsed this, because these works, I want to ask about painting. And in relation to these works in particular, I read something that you had written about painting in the context of fear. And so I don't want to ask you about the strategy. I want you to ask about why you were making an analogy between your fear and obsession with the sea and the process of painting, working in the context of wrestling with the fear.
Yeah, I mean, anybody and everybody in this room that has ever painted a painting knows that it's a ludicrously difficult thing to do, and it's stupid to set out to try to do it. And but you have this great idea, and you think, oh, I know, I'll look at some other paintings that'll cheer me on. And you look at other paintings and you think, how the hell did they do that? I don't know how it's done, because of course what you see in galleries is some finished thing, some polished, finished, bought and sold sometimes many times things. So that doesn't give you a clue, because you don't see the back of the envelope stuff, you don't see the rubbish drawings that lead to it, and you don't see the layers of mistakes underneath, unless you're on Fake or Fortune and you see the thing, the microscope thing. So it's a fearful thing to do because it's ridiculous, because you're trying to talk about time and space and life and love and death and the elements and all the rest of it with a piece of cloth stretched over some wood and some colours. And so I start out absolutely knowing what I'm going to do, and I think you said, Ingrid said the other day, because I was talking about the show that I'm going to have at the New Museum in New York next year, and she said, I think you're talking this show into existence. So I kind of talk about it, and I know what I'm doing. I realise what I'm doing is I'm kind of building up the courage to do it. And then if I talk about it, I think, well, I've said I'm going to do this, and now I'm going to have to do it. And so there are lots and lots of moments through the painting of a painting where it's a terrible, terrible painting. And I have the sort of studio that is in my home, and so people are very often in those studios, and they're in there, or I tried not to let them in there, but when they have been in the past, in the studio when the painting is on, it's horrible and not working, and so the relationship is to do with fear, is to do with that having to keep painting it, to dig it out of this terrible hole that I've dug myself into. But I also use them in a way, the paintings, that as I'm painting them, as a kind of handbook, a kind of manual for how to be braver, so that I feel the fear and do it anyway. Great book, by the way. And also, I sometimes talk about, making great friends with fear, because that is fear and failure, really. Because that's the only way to get to the heart of what a painting can do. It's so fluid, and it's very peculiar looking at these, because the one on the right, I often look at this painting and I think, what were you doing? What were you doing? Why on earth? I have no idea why I painted that painting, why I thought I could actually put it out there in an exhibition. And I haven't actually seen it on a wall, I have to say, since probably 1990.
When was this one? Since then?
Since then.
Since it was, in Rochdale in, I have, 1992.
1992. So it was on the wall in Rochdale in 1992. It was maybe on the wall, actually, yes, in the South Bank Centre in something like 1990. I'm looking at Kate now, because she brought her daughters when they were very small. 1993, I think, only maybe a year later. See, I rely on everyone on
collective memory.
Date. But and now Tate have this painting, so I'm daring you now to put it out on the wall. I have no idea why it looks like it looks. I just think it's the most outrageous painting. I'm thinking, so I think I certainly danced with fear in that painting, but I'm still afraid of it.
Yeah, well, while you were talking and I was nodding, my husband was laughing, because one of the things that he often says about me is that the painting myself into a corner is the only way to do anything that is a challenge or slightly beyond where we are. And it's only in listening to you talk just then that I realised it's a painting metaphor that I've been using all this time.
Yeah, because it's so that, as I work in acrylics as well, so you can paint and then you can go make a cup of tea, and what you've painted has dried. So there's no moving it about. So then if you want to change it, you have to overpaint it. So there's layer on layer, because the first brushstrokes are not always right. But that's how I like to do it. Yeah. I have a plan, and then I don't follow the plan.
Right. Excellent. And we'll come back to overpainting and painting that is not on the conventional canvas surface. But I wanted to ask a question about movement, really, oceans and rivers and seas. When I look across the body of your work, they come up again and again. And these are Venetian maps. And it's some very beautiful writing when this was first shown about nearly all of our experiences seeing Venice for the first time as an extraordinary place. But I was thinking about the patterns of movement and kind of migration that come up again and again in your work.
Yeah, well, I think for sure the water comes up again and again because I was born in Zanzibar, surrounded by water. When I was 4 months old, I came to Britain, and I came off the plane. I was screaming. Actually, my mother says that I was screaming all the way from Zanzibar to London. But it was a long time ago, so there were lots of different planes, Zanzibar to Dar es Salaam to Better, all the way from Nice to wherever it was. But I was, we got off the plane and then met my auntie and my mother's best friend off the bus that used to bring, the airport bus. And then we got on a train, and now I get on that train very often, at Euston Station, and went to Blackpool, which is where my grandmother lived. Yeah. So I went from Zanzibar to Blackpool in the space of maybe a week, aged 4 months. And so that whole business and then went to Blackpool over and over again, for many years later. And now I live about 20 minutes away from Blackpool. So that whole sort of thing of the sea just as a sort of something that's very close to me, that I don't understand. I think I have probably never in my entire life, as well as never actually gone camping, I also never have swum in the sea. As you can tell, somebody about to invite me on a nice warm beach holiday. That would be great. Well, I won't come. I'll just bring my friends. So there's that kind of, I want to look at the sea, I want to kind of engage with its danger and its sorrow, I guess, and attempt to paint it as if I had never seen it, and as if I'd never seen any astonishing British paintings of the sea. As British painters do better than anything in the past is work out ways to paint this thing. But to try to paint it as if, A, you've never seen the sea and never seen a painting of the sea has really pushed the way I kind of use paint. I spent a couple of months in St Ives, again a few decades ago, around 98, 99, and I spent all day, every day, for 2 separate months, looking out of the lifeguard's hut, watching what the sea and the sky and the sand did, just watching it all day, and making paintings on paper to try and catch it, to try and catch the light, catch the colour, catch the kind of the sorrow of it, the wrecks, the fishing, and all that kind of humanity in it. And it pushes the painting a lot, as well as referring, of course, to the Atlantic trafficking. So 2 things are happening. A bigger political thing is happening, but also let's see how we can allow a conversation to happen about trying to do something that's both invisible and impossible. So that's the sort of where it's coming from, lots of those different sorts of experiences and conversations, with myself.
And that sense of the invisible and the impossible also seems to me very interesting and important.
It is, yeah. I mean, I suppose I don't know what slide's coming up, but it might come up in a minute, but that installation, Naming the Money, seemed, when I thought about it, impossible, and to make 100 wooden cutouts and have them stand in a room together, talking about, each person talking about their life, and being very visible to each other and very visible to whoever came to the installation. And of course, everyone that came made the installation different, because you have 100 people there, and then you have more people if people come and see it. But that making people visible that had previously been invisible in the histories, invisible in the paintings. So you have lots of those paintings of British aristocracy. Over to one side are black servants, black slave servants, lots of Hogarth paintings, Cruikshank caricatures, Gilray caricatures of black people who are visible but invisible, their contribution. I mean, now I would say, yes, we're much more visible in terms of newspapers, television, film, whatever, in a way that in the early 1980s we were really, in terms of that media, totally invisible. Yeah. But I just think that the contribution that those histories of people, is still a bit invisible. It's not really quite written into the histories yet, you know. So, yeah, I have often set impossible tasks, how to make 100 people from a history, but from nothing, in a way, and how to make invisible visible.
And it seems, I mean, they're made incrementally, and their power is in the way in which we're able to experience one after the other. And so there isn't a figure, there isn't a single history that emerges. There are the multiplicity of roles, names, positions, and so it's in that accumulation, it's in the seriality that...
It is, but I think really the power of it is that when you go into the room with it, you are bringing your own experience of being called one thing, but other people calling you something else. But somehow hanging on to the fact of who you really are, and that's the thing that kind of carries you through. And because everybody in every room, that happens to them. Do you know what I mean? Because Ingrid would joke now that my name is actually Turner Prize-winning Lubaina Himid. So my first name is now Turner Prize-winning Lubaina Himid. But I am still that other person. But I have to hang on to that, understanding that other person, that was not a Turner Prize-winning person, to make work. And there are plenty of people in this room that wanted to be one thing and understood that they would always be that thing, a dancer, whatever. And then that didn't quite pan out, but they still enjoy the dance, or they enjoy going to see it, or they feel sort of music through their body, and they hang on to that, and it makes life for them worth living. And I think because people bring that, not necessarily at all the history of the slave trade to that room, they bring that, then it energizes the staff. You know, I think that's why that works, because I don't really know why it works, but I think that's why.
And we were talking before we came up onto the stage about your work at the V&A in 2007, where figures were placed within the collections, and I think, my initial frustration with that, as we were saying, is that they weren't named properly. They weren't allowed to have the space that they demanded.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, there's a great, of course, absolutely the way this should be shown is 100 cutouts in an enormous room, or a series of rooms. But there is that other story about how they are signifiers for the great wealth, the wealth of Europe, as well as the wealth of the Americas, but the great wealth of Europe. So it's very important to see the kind of textures, textiles, fabric on the clothes of these people next to the lace, the velvet, the embroidery, the inlaid wood, the incredible installations that are in the V&A. So that was incredibly important, but what those figures were doing was signifying the wealth, and they became again sort of individual lone figures instead of this mass. And how they were made was that you're in this mass, you can either read the names and the life stories of those people by looking at the back, or you can hear the life stories with me reading each set of each one on an audio system with music. But if you're just looking at them front on, you don't know who these people are. But the nature of a museum and an object museum is that there isn't much room to get about if you put these things in the middle of the in the middle of the showing space. So they have to be up against a wall. And all it needed really was the label that's on the back to be on the wall. But of course the thing about the V&A is that also the very fabric of it is quite difficult to do this. It was then anyway, to do this equal labelling. Yeah. So that a contemporary piece is equal to a historic piece, so we could give it equal labelling. And I think that was it. It was fighting a sort of hierarchy of labelling. Yeah. But now I think that's been... I just showed a few of them in the Walker in Liverpool, because they hold... Well, the Slavery Museum, Liverpool museums hold 90 of these now, and I have 10 of them. And I said, I really can't do this unless they have equal labelling. But many years have passed, of course, and they moved things aside and they put labels on them.
And partly because of the impact of work like yours, institutions are and have shifted, and quite rightly. And it's actually, I think, rather wonderful to see now that there'll become a time where you wouldn't even have to remind people that equal labelling is entirely possible and the only way you would wish to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just the time. It was...
It wasn't just the time, it was the time, and there's been a useful expansion of the space available to debate these issues.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I'm not going to take entire credit for it.
No, there were many things going on, but you are part of that. I was going to take us back to cotton.com, partly so we could talk about Manchester.
Uh-huh.
And I was always fascinated by this being made for Cube, which doesn't exist now in Manchester. And I wasn't in Manchester then, but I heard of it. I was in Birmingham at that stage. Mm-hmm. But it's always fascinated me that these are paintings of textiles, really. And so it is cotton, but it is definitely painting. And that's also in common with lots of your work, where you are using painting in ways that it isn't conventionally used. So there's two questions here. One is about doing that, and then there's another question about the history that is being sort of investigated in cotton.com.
I don't know, why isn't it conventional? I'm painting patterns on... Mm-hmm.
But partly because of the title, I think. When I first approached this work, I presumed what you would be working with is textile, not paint.
Oh, I see.
Especially because it was Manchester, and I realised I was reading all sorts into this as a piece that must be about cotton. And of course it is a piece that's about cotton,
Yes.
but it's about cotton in paint.
Yes, and it's about, actually it's about conversations, of course, as usual, about imagined conversations between plantation workers, slave workers, and the Lancashire mill workers. So it's both an imagined set of conversations and a real set of conversations. So there are 100 paintings. Every one of them a different pattern. And the patterns come from all over the place. I mean, there are African patterns, but there are also patterns that are European patterns, Austrian patterns, French patterns, Italian patterns, British patterns, and just totally invented patterns. And but each one of those paintings is accompanied by, in my head and in reality, an account of what working in those two sets of industry was like. So there are texts that say things like, my brother's leg was severely damaged yesterday because the dogs caught him when he was trying to escape, and also texts that read, my brother can't stop coughing because of the dust on the factory floor. And it was a piece about there not being a kind of competition between these two sets of workers, that all of us were conned by the same enormous force. But I tried to turn that whole... I mean, lots of the work I make, I'm looking at some very hard research that historians have often done, sometimes economic historians. But in this case, I was looking at a book someone had pointed in the direction of, that was an account of a British English inspector of plantations. And he had gone to the Carolinas and was inspecting plantations, not in terms of anti-slavery, but just to see what conditions were like. And so the description of these places and these conversations, a lot of them came from him. And he made an observation about, obviously, he considered to be a very beautiful black woman, carrying water. And he said in the text, she looked like a painting by Murillo. And he was obviously showing off about what he knew about painting. But I wanted to turn that around, and the text, which is in brass, says, he said, I looked like a painting by Murillo just because I carried water for the Ho gang. So something like that anyway. So she now has agency within that. So those texts that are there in my head are all being actually spoken by this one woman. It's very much about painting, but it's also about those different conversations across paintings, how one set of paintings informs another, and one set of conversations informs another, and how there isn't a sort of there isn't one painting.
Yeah. And the Lost Kangas, you made those for the Whitworth.
Yes, I did, and it was really, I don't know, it was a great moment, that really, because in a way, the Kangas are not lost, of course, the sample books are lost. There's, obviously Manchester had this great history of total association existence because of the textile industry. And I knew that many of the patterns designed for African cloths were actually designed in Manchester.
Yeah.
And so there's a sort of, that kind of history is lost. My connection with Manchester is quite strong because if you were, like my mother, brought up in Blackpool, Manchester was a sort of a place to be poo-pooed, and London was the thing. And when she came to the Royal College of Art at 18 or whatever, she never wanted to go back at all. And I guess for me, as a kind of champion of a small city that is in this kind of in the middle of this smooth bowl where Manchester is here and Liverpool is here and Preston is here in the kind of slidey, shiny bit, and it's really difficult to kind of do that. And people from Manchester won't necessarily come to Preston, so people from Preston have to go to Manchester. So it has a kind of, somewhere to be conquered in quite a particular way. So working at the Whitworth, which had in the past, was probably one of the few galleries that had reduced me to tears on more than one occasion. I have to say, you can feel sorry for me now, but I would come out of that place so mad with how it was, so angry with the kind of way it functioned and thought of itself, before you got down, let's say. And so to then be able to go into the belly of the beast of the thing, work with the textile curators, where they had a few kangas. The thing about kangas is that they're not expensive traditional cloths. They're like a T-shirt, so they're very cheap and cheerful things, which is what I like about them. And so the Whitworth didn't have very many, but I worked with those and with my own collection to make these pieces of work, which really turned my life around. Working with the Whitworth turned my life around because I'd beaten that damn place into submission, and I could leave without crying with frustration. And I kind of made a kind of connection which really helped, again, with that sort of negotiating that I do between safety and danger. And the texts are always texts that are, they're kind of unambiguous but ambiguous. They're conversations with myself, and they're rallying cries, really, to other people to kind of, we would say, allow your friends to meet your enemies. I mean, that's craziness. It's absolute craziness. But it's kind of important. If you have the nerve to do that, then you're home free, really.
Well, I knew none of the history of frustration.
I was too polite ever to tell you.
Absolutely. but the whole show that you were part of, it's titled there, Cotton Global Threads, was a rallying cry made by Jennifer and Amy and the team there to say this is all fine. This is all fine art, and it's all not fine art.
Yeah.
And to say those things together.
And I think that was the thing, to be able to work with a museum/gallery, but through the textiles as opposed to through the fine art. It's through the fine art I couldn't get a conversation going. But of course it would be the textile curators who are just about understanding people, because textiles are all about people.
Yeah, very good. So I'm going to just take to another domestic object, and we mentioned overpainting. This dinner service is probably one of the best known of your works now. It's often the image that, no image stands for a whole when a practice is as diverse as yours, but these stand out in people's minds. I think because of the discombobulation they present us with.
Yes, I mean, Lancaster is kind of, was one of those really important cities in the history of British trade in slaves. And it's a rather innocent, rather pretty place now. But all of its buildings are tied up in that, all of its history. And I spent a lot of time roaming the streets of Lancaster. It was only 20 minutes away from Preston. Looking at things like the weeds that were growing, and looking at the walls, and looking at the bricks, and looking at the doorknobs, and all sort of tiny details of the city, to try and imagine what it might have been like to have been one of the 32 slave servants that worked in that city. And I could only imagine that the saving grace of it might be that you might see each other as you carried something from the market or whatever. But the paintings are really, they're about being those people, but they're also to show the kind of layers of complexity. The aristocrats, the wealthy people who were devastated at the abolition of the trade, the clergy who were often sitting on the fence, the Quakers who often had slaves themselves, part of plantation families, but also those people campaigning, as well as the people who we're actually talking about. And so all the plates are of either views of Lancaster, aristocrats vomiting, other ones dancing through the street, waving lace handkerchiefs because the abolition has been achieved. And all the tureens and all the jugs have the faces of Africans. And inside every tureen and inside every jug, you can find the name of those people. And the table that they were originally displayed on is a gillo table made from Caribbean mahogany. Mm-hmm. So it's actual mahogany from actually the Caribbean, brought back in actual slave ships that went in this triangular journey. And the table is about 6 meters long. And actually was the most precious thing in the judges' lodgings, which now, because of cuts to budgets, the judges' lodgings isn't open anymore. It's one of those terrible things. But the exciting thing about it was to show the work on that table, which they were quite daring to put contemporary work on a thing of such value. The other thing is that Lancaster is a sort of gateway to the lakes, so people go to museums and galleries there on their, perhaps on a rainy day when they're not tramping across the countryside, foolishly. And so many people that encountered this work thought it was real, which was great, that it really was a dinner service, or parts of dinner service from that time. And I know that never occurred to me. But yeah, so there were lots and lots of layers to it, and it was fun to collect the pieces. I collected the jugs and the plates and tureens from charity shops and junk shops and markets all over the region. So some of them were kind of very valuable plates, big meat chargers, with that horrible kind of trough in it. So you put the meat down and all the blood soaks into the trough. Very disgusting. And some were very lovely luster jugs, So I great pleasure in painting over those with acrylics.
Excellent. And of course, some of your works like this became part of the Turner Prize exhibition.
Yes, indeed.
Actually, I'm not going to talk about this. I want to come because I want to leave time for the audience to ask questions.
Okay.
To now. So what is going on in your studio just now?
Just now, it's a bit of a mess, actually. Just now I'm doing some work in response to a week I spent at The Guardian, in the belly of the beast, the editorial meetings of at The Guardian, where I was trying to argue the case for strange juxtapositions between images of black people and texts in their newspaper. So I'm making a series of work that are responding to exactly that week that I spent there. And because of those discussions that I had with them, where I'm saying my 10 years of collecting these pages from The Guardian between 2007 and 2016, taking out every page that had an image of a black person on, and looking at the rather dodgy juxtapositions. My saying that you need to do better. It's a great newspaper. We love it, those of us who are kind of champions of it, but you need to do better. Don't care what the Times does, don't care what Daily Mail does. You need to do better. But I was in these meetings, and many, many editors said, these juxtapositions are random. These juxtapositions are coincidence. Can't be so. It just can't be so.
No.
So, but I carried on, and I was very polite, because I'm very, very, very well brought up, and I just kept trying to sort of show paintings that I'd made that showed this, and ones that hadn't been painted at all. Can you see what you did there? You know, can you see what you did there? Anyway, I'm making this set of work, so all those are all over the studio floor, and the series is going to be called Random Coincidences. But I'm thinking about the show at the New Museum, getting the canvases bought and getting the wood bought. I'm going to make I'm really talking this into existence now, so I absolutely
okay,
have...
everyone wants to hear this.
I'm going to make a bigger version of Drowned Orchard's Secret Boatyard that you saw earlier, so a big set of planks that kind of go up and down the wall.
Yeah, we'll
Sort of taller, wider, but grey. No colour.
And why no colour?
Because I'm trying to make the perfect grey painting. And I've said before that even this is part of that, to try to make the perfect grey painting. You can see I failed there. So naming the money, I failed
a little bit
there.
of red and blue kind of snuck in there.
Yeah, but this time, this is it. This is the moment. And I've said it to the curator now, so I've got to do it now. So there'll be just grey, a bit of white, a tiny bit of red maybe, but... So that's going to happen any minute, and some paintings about making clothes, and some paintings about making buildings.
And are they going to be paintings on canvas, or are they paintings in drawers? Or because I haven't even asked you about the lovely phrase, which I think comes from Zoe actually, about making the, or at least in her interview with you, about making the ordinary extraordinary. Through the process of open a drawer and there is.
Yeah, but you know how if you open your own chest of drawers, you see what you see in there, but you also know what isn't in there and what there's too much of in there. There are the socks that you never wear now, but you just might keep them in case you just haven't done the laundry for 17 days and you really need that last pair of socks. So there's that about opening drawers, but there's also to buy old furniture or second-hand furniture, and it's kind of disgusting in a way, but you open it and you can smell other people's lives in the drawers, or you can see their hair grips, or you can see bits of dust and hair and things. But I'm painting men in those drawers because that's where people's lives are in those drawers. So quite often I'm talking about their histories and people's lives being embedded in furniture or in the nooks and crannies of buildings, in between the bricks or under the floorboards, or and in the air as well, you know. So yeah, that it seems to me that the everyday is extraordinary. I mean, it just is extraordinary that you can do something as simple as open a drawer and smell and taste a history coming out of it.
Yeah. I am very struck by how you have returned in this last hour to smell or taste. And we think of you so much in visual terms, but actually you are explaining and engaging with your own work through the other senses.
Yes, I mean, and quite often I want to put sound in as well. And more recently, I remixed the sound for Naming the Money. So I work with a woman in Preston that's a printmaker, really, but also makes sound pieces, Magda Stavashka-Bevan, and she made me understand about how that we do this thing called inner listening. So she talks about listening through going through place and listening to memories that you have had there. And so sometimes we have those sorts of conversations, but she also taught me a very simple thing, that if you want to make great sound pieces, you have to make them in places where everything is about sound. You know, you can't make a recording of your voice for Naming the Money in your front room necessarily, which is what I did the first time, and have it really have real power, because there are these distracting other noises happening. So I re-spoke all the 100 phrases again for the Bristol show, and we remixed it and redid the music. And I like to have that sound going through, if it's possible, because I think the whole experience of being in some of the pieces is about what you hear in your head, and about, I mean, I suppose, I make a lot of the work that I make all the work I make listening to something else. Either, not so much now, but in former years, lots of these things were made with football on in the background, live matches, where the men who are describing those matches can see the football, obviously, but if you know the basic rules, you can see what's happening as well. So you can see, Theo Walcott running up the right-hand side. You can see him do it, and you can see him passing the ball across, and you see some other person put in the goal, or whatever. And I like to do that thing where I'm listening to something, quite often music, and sometimes I'm listening to television. So there is a television in my studio, and I'm not watching the television, really I'm not. I'm listening to the television. The tennis, motor racing, those sorts of things, and fighting against it. It's a bit like fighting against, like I've said about the dark blue paint on my studio wall that I used to have to kind of make the colours brighter. I painted the studio wall very dark blue so that I was fighting against that dark blue, so that when they were on white walls, then they would really do this. Yeah. What was the question about? I've rambled on now.
Why is that grey, really?
Yeah,
it's time we take a question from the audience.
Okay.
It was about all the other senses.
Oh, yeah. So I did answer it.
And you also remind me of something I don't have an image of, but the other works of yours in Manchester Art Gallery's pieces, of course, are dandy footballers.
Oh, yes.
I've forgotten about those remarkable figures.
Yeah, we don't have images of those, do we? No. Yes. Taylor Striker, singer dandy.
Yeah. So, who would like to ask a question? If you could just wait for the microphone, that would be really helpful.
Yes.
And I'll put some on.
I'm so interested in your story of coming from Zanzibar and the water and the sea and the stuff with the slavery, obviously, in Bristol. Have you ever thought about doing some paintings with the refugees and failed asylum seekers that I work with, and I know a lot of people? It's a big issue we have in the country at the moment. Is that something that would interest you? It just seems like the resonances of what I'm actually working with, and many people are working with this issue in our cities. Just feels like this would be it would be wonderful to have that kind of voice presenting.
When you say with, what do you mean by with?
Oh, I work with homeless failed asylum seekers.
You said, what do you think about working with refugees on this? Do you mean about refugees, or do you mean with refugees?
No, I mean you doing your painting, showing their story, showing the story of the people that have coming in the boats from Libya across the water.
That's what these paintings are about.
Yes,
I'm
just
already
saying
about that.
Yeah, no, exactly.
So Naming the Money is about that. Cotton.com is about that. The Lancaster Dinner Service is about that.
Yes.
But
now, I'm just saying now. Would you be interested in doing it now? with the
I
current...
am doing it now.
Good.
I am doing it now. I'm trying to say that these histories, these often British histories, are still playing out. And they're playing out in exactly the way that you're describing, with real people that this is really happening to now. But I am a painter, and I'm not a campaigner. You know, I'm not quite convinced of the effectiveness of telling other people's stories better than they could tell them themselves. Do you know what I mean? I'm telling a story of me, but I'm also telling a kind of great overview story. But those kind of individual stories, I think the people who have lived that story need to be given agency, or they need to take agency, or helped to take agency, to tell that story themselves. So when you were saying you had to work with those people, a bit of me thought, well, that would be incredibly difficult, but I'd be much more interested in an idea of speaking to a few people and them finding ways to tell that story in the way that they would tell that story.
Yes, I suppose I'm just thinking from my point of view how wonderful to have some beautiful pieces of work that would show the story that some of us are trying to tell. But you're quite right, it's not your job, you're not a politician.
No, but it's our job to talk about it, that's right. Yeah.
Anyway, it does definitely resonate with what is happening with many people working in this sector now, so props to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question. Middle and then a bit further back.
I was just wondering, in relation to your depiction of the art critic in A Fashionable Marriage, what your opinions on the critiquing and reviewing of art are. Art being such a subjective, sort of creative idea, and also sort of the idea, this obsession with valuation of art, which I think comes with the increasing of trade as art as a commodity. And I was wondering how these sort of ideas fit in with your practice of art and the approach you take to art.
Ooh, okay. Well, I suppose the art critic, when I made that piece, I think the art critic was a kind of different creature. I think maybe the art critic maybe actually had more agency than an art critic has now. There are very few really good ones now. And I don't actually know that by what I've read, but I know that by the questions that art critics have or haven't asked me. And so when they are asking me really, incredibly decent questions where they have done the work, then I don't need to read the piece, because I know they have made all sorts of connections for themselves and are trying to ask more questions than the usual questions. So that's one thing. But then you're talking about art as a commodity. Well, it has always been a bit of a commodity, In Western Europe, it's always been a bit of a commodity. I don't really know what you're asking me. Are you wanting me to say I'm really cross about how much paintings cost? Because on the one hand, I am, but on the other hand, I'm not. Mm-hmm. I think that there's something very interesting about being collected, probably my work is in a lot of museums, but in the very early days, very, very early days, it was only a museum that would want to buy them, not because they were expensive, but because museums knew them. But then there was a period where I gave the work to museums because I feel they're incredibly important places, and I wanted the work to be in places that were free and where you could have a chance encounter with that work. Museums have sort of had to become more conservative as they've had less money to spend, and they're being squeezed in a way that is nasty. I think some of the amazing things about private collectors is that very often they are passionate about the work, and quite often they are working in collaboration with museums and want to put the work in museums, or are very happy to lend it to museum shows. So there are all sorts of complicated things going on beneath the surface of how much the latest this or that cost. You know, sometimes there are some really interesting and intelligent conversations going on that are not about the money that something costs.
Thank you. Next question, a bit further back.
Hi, Lubaina. My name's Anshu.
Hi.
When you said that you'd never swum in the sea,
And
that you looked at the sea, and you felt it was full of danger and sorrow.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, for a lot of people, we look at institutions like the Tate or the Guardian, and we look at a dangerous place full of danger and sorrow.
Mm-hmm.
We're kind of drawn to it, but we might not jump in for fear of being taken under. And how your work, in a sense, is like the life rafts. You know, you might be taken under, but the work can't be taken under because it's so good. I wonder, when you were talking about The Guardian, I was just reading Afua Hirsch's book that she brought out recently, British, in which she talks about racism without racists and how so many liberal institutions, you know, fit that bill. And I don't have a question, that's it.
I don't have an answer either, except we just have to keep talking to each other, telling each other what we feel, what we see, and talking is the answer. You know, really it is. You know, because I have been making these works for 40 years, there is a difference. There is a ton of things that are the same, but there is a difference. There really, really is, and not just for me. There is. But it's not, the job's not done. You know?
I mean, I would. You said something elsewhere that I'd written down as one of my prompts, and it's about this sense of the historical trauma that vibrates still around buildings, historical buildings that we now inhabit, and we inhabit a history, much of which is not pleasant, and carries. The word you used is lingers, so it's like that smell is still around. And we have to learn how to inhabit them differently. Yeah,
and acknowledge it.
Yes,
you know,
absolutely. As you said, then we need to become protagonists in the space that will change it in the now and in the future.
Yeah.
As you're only just 45, and as an artist, your career so far, what would you say is your, I would say, proudest moment as an artist?
Well, it really seems like sucking up to this place, right?
That's all right, we're approaching the end.
But you know what that is. It was the staging of Thin Black Lines in 2011 in this place. It was like I absolutely understood then that something was changing. And I was so, you know, it was such a moment when Penelope Curtis came into that space, and the work, as you know, was lying around the walls, not installed yet by your incredible team. And she said, this work is still so fresh. And I thought, yeah, I think that, but, you know, I'm really glad somebody else thinks that, because I knew it had power, and I knew it was good. And that was the most frightening week I'd ever spent before or since, was standing in that room. I don't know which gallery it is in this place. I don't know what number it is or whatever. 47. Number 7, gallery number 7, rigid with fear, but I'm not allowed to touch any of the work because, of course, there are exhibition handlers who are supposed to do that and who did that and who would move things this way and that way and up and that. And I couldn't touch anything, and I stood in that room rigid with terror for a week, with the conservatives coming in and out, handlers coming in and out, big-time Tate curators coming in and out, frightened to death that it wasn't going to work, but I could see that it could work. And I placed it in a particular way, and it was all right, you know, around the room. And Penelope Curtis came and said, would you mind if I just adjusted a couple of things? And I thought, no. Okay. So, no, not at all. And she just said, you know, if you put the Ingrid Pollards here and you split up the carrot piece here, it would work. And your team did that, and it was like, yes, it was beautiful. And the room was singing in a way that I meant it to do. And so that utterly was it. All the rest of it is like, it's good. Lots of it's really, really good. But that was the moment I really thought, I know we can win now.
It did seem an important moment.
Do we have a final question before we have to close this wonderful evening?
Try and make it quick. You talked a little bit about, we talked quite a lot about being polite and being angry. And I'm just wondering whether being polite is a tactic that we have to employ, because, as Anshu mentioned, the liberal institution doesn't want to deal with an angry person of colour, but they'll deal with a polite person of colour. Is it a conscious? Because there is anger, I think.
Here in me.
Yeah, I'd say. So what, you know, you have to do something. Do you have to put it aside when you deal with?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I can do it. I can put the anger to one side, and I can negotiate. I don't think that everybody should. I don't think that everybody can, but because I can, I do it. I'll get cross for you if you want me to. I got very cross last year in the Turton Prize, so I could, you know, I can get cross. I can express how angry I am, but I think, so I think some of the time it's my job to leave gaps so that conversations can take place. Yes.
And I can say, having worked with you, that your reasonableness is one of the greatest forces known to man or womankind. And out of that, because there is an insistence, which is about staying in a conversation.
It's about staying alive.
Well, that seems a very wonderful point then to finish.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.